All right, everyone. Hello and welcome to today's Leader to Leader, a budget-focused Leader to Leader for us today with some special guests from the State Budget Office. We're going to get started here. Just a couple of notes. As we move through things today, we're going to be using the Q&A feature to keep track of questions. So if you have a question to pose, please put it in the Q&A as we go along, and you'll also be able to upvote other questions that are in there. As you're checking in today, if you haven't yet, please introduce yourself in the chat. Also use the chat as a way to add comments and ideas as we go along. But if you can, try to keep the questions in the Q&A feature. It'll help us be a little bit more organized on our end. Note also that at the end of the presentation today, we're going to be sharing a copy of both slide decks that we're using and a link to the recording of today's session. And we will be distributing those in Friday's COVID-19 Daily. If you didn't have a chance, I also want to draw your attention to the fact that we did a Know Before You Go video. If you didn't have a chance to watch it before you joined today, it would be a great thing to watch maybe afterwards, just as a refresher for yourself on some of the basics of the K-12 budget, so that you have sort of a background knowledge that you might need moving forward. The link is there, and we'll also make sure that it goes in the chat and goes out to you after this is over. So our agenda today, just some quick welcomes and introductions, and then we're going to hand it over to our panelists today, Beth Bullion and Bethany Wicksall. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Bob Kefgen. I'm MASSP's Director of Government Relations. Also with us today, our Executive Director, Wendy Zadeb, Colin Rittmaster, Ryan Casey is running our tech. I also, it looks like Matt Alley is also on the call today. And I also now want to introduce our special guests. Bethany Wicksall is the Director of Legislative and External Affairs for the State Budget Office. And Beth Bullion is the Director of the Office of Education within the State Budget Office. It's a rare treat for me that I actually get to host a town hall with these guys. We don't generally do a whole ton of budget work. As principals, usually by the time the budget gets down to the building level, a lot of the decisions have been made. But it's really important, given everything that's going on and all the different moving parts, that principals have a solid understanding of what the budget's potentially going to look like this year. And so Bethany and Beth have agreed to join us and give us a quick overview. I've had the pleasure of working with these guys for a while now. They are two of the most knowledgeable people when it comes to the K-12 budget in the state of Michigan. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and invite Bethany and Beth, or Bethany, to start sharing hers.
All right, there we go. So thanks for having us. And thanks, Bob, for that. We appreciate all the work we do with you. Hopefully today we can at least give you just a little bit of a glimpse of where we're at. There's still a lot of uncertainty, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So just to give you a little bit of a picture, you know, and I think I have some actual revenue slides after, but I won't bury that as long as we're looking at these. I mean, you know, if you look at some of the current estimates that are floating around right now, we might be looking at potentially, on average, a $3 billion hole for the remainder of this year and another $3 billion hole for next year. And that's a combined general fund and school aid fund budget number. Depending on the analyst, you know, those change a little bit, and we'll know more next week when we have a revenue estimating conference. But you can see on this slide the combined general fund and school aid fund budgets for the state, and it's just under $25 billion. So you can see that we are talking about, you know, more than 10% of the budget with less than half the year for us at the state level, and obviously with more like 6 weeks for those of you, both local governments and school districts, that are on a July 1 to June 30 calendar year or fiscal year, rather than the state's October 1 to September 30 fiscal year. So it's a pretty significant hit if you try to annualize what we would need to get out of the remainder of the year in order to come up with $3 billion. That's especially hard if you look at the slide, and you can see that over 3/4 of this combined general fund and school aid fund budget goes back out to other entities. So we're not keeping most of that at what you would otherwise consider government. That's primarily, obviously, in the school aid portion that you see. It's in higher education and community colleges. It's in health and human services, so much of that goes back out to health providers, hospitals, nursing homes, primary care. And then you can see another 10% of what we would sort of typically consider state government. The part we are keeping is in corrections and state police, so public safety, and then a small portion of debt service, and then all other state government sort of in that 7% left in the gray pie slice. So, unfortunately, when you start to talk about those the size of that potential reduction, you're going to have to share some of that across some of those external entities that are receiving those state funds. And then this is just isolated on the general fund side so that you can see sort of a similar issue. I mean, if we assume that the school aid fund, balance is absorbed by the school aid fund side of the world, meaning districts and higher education and community colleges, the general fund in the end is just this $10.6 billion. And again, over 80% of what we're doing from a general government side of the world is basically in health and human services, corrections, higher ed, and then, state police and debt service. So it's a slightly larger share, but we could basically wipe out 12 state departments and the legislature and the judicial branch. And that's all in that gray pie slice. And we still wouldn't come up with a third, given that we're more than halfway through the year, of what we would need to solve that hole if we were going to try to do it all on the general fund side. And so then this just gives you a picture of sort of the revenue reductions that have been public so far. We will soon see revenue estimates at the Consensus Revenue Estimating Conference next Friday that we'll actually have to use. But, so Treasury did put out some scenarios in March. This was very early on in the COVID response. And so the ranges were very large while they didn't have a lot to go from. And they estimated at that time $1 to $3 billion shortfall combined general fund school aid fund in 20 and a $1 to $4 billion potential reduction in 21. We think at this point, 6 weeks later, that we're probably looking towards the higher end of those reductions, the worst end of those reductions. A couple of weeks ago, the U of M Research Seminar in Quantitative Economics, or RSQE, put out their economic forecast and resulting revenue impact, and they have suggested a $2.6 billion reduction in 20 and a $3.2 billion reduction in 21. So in the similar ballpark. In RSQE's economic model is one of the key bases for what Treasury and House and Senate fiscal agencies use for their revenue estimates next week at the Revenue Estimating Conference. So this at least, will potentially, heavily inform some of those estimates as well. So it's pretty significant, as I said, and you saw sort of, what that will look like on the actual pie charts. So just so you know, sort of what we've been given to work with from a state level on to deal with COVID-19 specifically. Before the legislature left in March, they did appropriate $150 million for us to do some immediate state needs. The first $50 million was automatic, and we could use that for generally whatever we needed. Basically, we have now exceeded that already just in FEMA match, and most of that money is dedicated to things like personal protection equipment, some testing supplies, ventilators, setting up the alternative care sites at TCF, Cobo Hall, and Suburban Showplace in Novi that were opened for some additional hospital space. There was $50 million for hospitals and health providers that we have shared with hospitals, nursing homes, behavioral health, and some of our federally qualified health centers in order to help give them primarily some cash flow support, because it's such a small amount compared to the shortfalls they're also seeing. But that's because they also are receiving $175 billion nationwide, specifically to them through the several federal bills that have passed since this was first happened. So those have gone out in a number of ways, but this was to sort of help get them to cover some of that short-term need in the interim. And then we have another $50 million available to us upon transfer by the Appropriations Committee. And as I mentioned, we're basically through the first 50. So we suspect that even just in FEMA match alone, we might need to use the rest of this or get the legislature, ask them to approve this transfer to dip further into that. So as I mentioned then, obviously much of what the state is experiencing in cost is FEMA eligible. And that's also true for local governments. And the FEMA does come with a 25% state or local match unless that's been waived. States have requested basically a blanket waiver, and we've also requested a specific one for our states and our local units of government. We haven't had any feedback on that yet. That could come from a number of different ways. So it could be waived in total, and FEMA can do that by itself, and it can change the share. So it could increase the share that they'll pay. It could end up being 90-10. We've heard different rumors. The White House could direct it to do so, and also Congress can direct it to do so. There have been hints that that this has been part of some of the most recent CARES Act round, sort of 2.0, but really 4.0 is as far as federal bills go, that we're still waiting to see some additional funding for. And so Congress may have some interest in asking them to waive at least a portion of that. So that would free up some of that general fund that I talked about on the last slide. And then the other large share that's non-education related that we have at our disposal right now is in the Federal CARES Act, the 3.0 version of the federal bill. And for those of you who haven't been tracking, there were sort of two early versions that were very small. And then there was the CARES Act, which is really CARES Act 1.0, but Federal Bill 3.0, Stimulus 3.0. So that's the confusion in it. And then 2 weeks ago, there was a slight bump. So they're sort of calling that 3.5. And then they're talking about another large round of stimulus that would maybe be 4.0. That hopefully we'll get in the next couple of weeks. But in that, it had a coronavirus relief fund that had $150 billion for states and local units of government to share. It directly allocated funds to any local unit that had a population greater than 500,000. So in Michigan, that meant $800 million split up between Kent, Oakland, Macomb, Wayne counties, and the city of Detroit. So they got that share off the top. And then the state received the balance of our allocation, which is $3.1 billion. Unfortunately, they put some pretty tight purse strings on this money, basically saying that it has to be for COVID-specific expenses, for things in line items that weren't already in our existing state budget, and costs that are incurred between March 1 and December 31. Obviously, currently, if we're looking at that size of a revenue shortfall, our first request, if they had asked, would have been, unrestricted, flexible revenue that we could use to backfill that revenue shortfall so that we don't have to make subsequent cuts, especially when so many of our COVID-19 costs are FEMA eligible. And so, we're looking at this. We do have a number of requests coming in on how we might be able to spend these funds, especially from local units of government that were too small to meet their direct allocation threshold. So we're looking at some of those things, but obviously we're also trying to be very careful because there's been some discussion about giving us retroactive flexibility to use this for revenue backfill at the congressional level, and they're talking about potentially adding that into the next round. They're also talking about, we've seen numbers for anywhere from another $250 billion to yeah, I was going to say this sounds huge, but to $1 trillion. So, directed to states and local governments, some of it that would be directly to locals, maybe sending out a direct allocation to those smaller units. And so we're trying to be careful on what we do with that and balancing out what's coming. And obviously, if they give us retroactive flexibility on that, we'd like to be able to use some of this then to offset that revenue loss so that we don't have to make significant cuts to local governments and schools for the remainder of the year. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Beth, and she'll talk about the education pieces.
Thanks, Bethany, and good afternoon, everyone. So the CARES Act that was passed in March basically has three large pots of funding sources for education purposes. Those three are bulleted here. The first one is Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund, and this totals roughly $390 million. The second is the Governor's Education Emergency Relief Fund, totaling about $89.4 million. And then thirdly is the Higher Ed Emergency Relief Fund, totaling just under $350 million. The next couple of slides just kind of go into a little more detail on those funds. So again, the first one is the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund, or it has been termed the ESSER Fund. It totals $390 million. However, 90% of that will go out via a formula. It's basically through the Title I allocation formula. So 90% of those funds, or about $350 million, would be directed or distributed to local school districts, which would include charter schools as well. The remaining 10%, so 9.5%, basically could be used for purposes determined by the superintendent of instruction. So the Michigan Department of Ed will determine how the other 10% may be used. And then of course they can keep a 0.5% for administrative purposes. The uses of funds are fairly broad, I would say. Districts can use the funds they receive under the ESSER fund for any activity that's authorized by the ESEA, IDEA, Adult Ed, Perkins. So any of those education provisions, as well as for school resources necessary to address needs in schools. So this is very, very broad. It could be used for purchases of technology, connectivity to internet, professional development, any of those types of things that school districts are facing in terms of the response to remote learning and to the COVID crisis. It could also be used for things like training, sanitation, and mental health services. I believe so. The Michigan Department of Ed has applied for these funds and they have received these funds. So last I knew, as of yesterday, they were preparing some guidance for schools that should be out shortly, as well as a streamlined application for which districts would apply for those funds. So I believe that's the status of that. And then the next pot is the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund. Michigan is expected to receive about $89.4 million under this provision. That, from a national perspective, is distributed by formula as well. That's based on population and poverty. So these funds could be distributed, I would say, in three different ways. One would be to LEAs, or local districts, that are determined by the state education agency to be most impacted. Number two, to institutions of higher ed that the governor determines to be most impacted by the COVID crisis. And then that third bucket is to any other entity that the governor determines to be essential for carrying out emergency education services. So these, again, could be used very broadly for activities necessary to continue to provide education services and for the ongoing functionality of local districts and institutions of higher ed. The funds could also be used for the provision of childcare, as well as social and emotional or mental health services. I should say that this application, we are also in the process of submitting this application to the feds, as well as developing a potential framework for which these funds would be distributed. So we really don't have a lot of concrete answers in terms of how these funds will go out. Ultimately, that would be up to the governor and her team, but that's kind of where we are with that pot of money. Under the Higher Ed Emergency Relief Fund, so we're expecting about $350 million to come into the state. These funds are flowing directly to institutions of higher ed. 90% basically for 75% is based on Pell, and then 25% is based on non-Pell grant recipient rates, just to kind of even out the spread between Pell and non-Pell. So half of these funds have to be distributed by institutions to flow directly to provide student or relief to the students themselves, and then the other half can be maintained by the institutions. So those I would say are the three big pots of education-related funding under the CARES Act. So we are working feverishly, checking for guidance daily. I should also mention to you there is a maintenance of effort provision related to both the ESSER and the GEAR fund, is what we're calling the Governor's Emergency Fund, by which the state can't reduce funding levels below a 3-year average for fiscal year 2020 and fiscal year 2021. However, this maintenance of effort or MOE provision could potentially be waived by the Secretary of Education. So I just wanted to highlight that as well. And then I'll turn it over to Bethany to do a budget timeline and wrap up, and then we can take some questions.
Thanks, Beth. So one of the first, things we've done at the state level is to implement both a hiring and discretionary spending freeze, which we've had in place for over a month now. We've also, in fact, I should have updated this slide. We've also since had almost 3,000 state employees who were unable to work to full capacity due to their work having been shifted to their homes. They've been on temporary layoffs now for this is their second week. And, we're continuing to look at that. And in the meantime, the state budget office is working with all of our departments to evaluate other potential budget reductions, looking at fund balances and restricted fund sources and what we can use and where we might be able to take some reductions, and putting together some of those options for conversations with the governor and her team. As I mentioned before, next Friday is the Consensus Revenue Estimating Conference. I don't know, Bob, did you address what the CREC is in your Budget 101 video that you sent, and maybe some of your...
I didn't do a real discussion of the CREC, so...
Okay. I'll just say really quickly, twice a year then in January and May, Treasury and the fiscal agencies come to a consensus on what they believe the revenues are, both for the year that we're in and some of the out years. And in January, the governor has to use those numbers in order to build her budget proposal. And then in the May Revenue Estimating Conference, we have to use those numbers in order to actually then come to an agreement with the legislature on a balanced budget. So we look to those to then sort of set our final parameters on what we might have to do then for the current year. And then very quickly, and we're already sort of, as I mentioned, starting to have these conversations, we need to balance the fiscal year 20 budget right after that. That can happen in a couple of different ways, both from an executive order reductions, a potential negative supplemental, and on the school aid side, a proration. And I know this is sort of one of those questions. So maybe, Beth, if you want, you could jump in and talk a little bit about what a proration and what the automatic pieces happen. It's a good time to sort of fit that in.
Sure. Come Friday, May 15th, I think it's safe to say that we're going to have a slight budget shortfall. So at that point, that really triggers kind of a timeline. And so at the point the treasurer determines that the revenues are below the enacted budget for school aid, technically the treasurer will notify the state budget director. And then the state budget director will notify the legislature that barring any additional action by the legislature, within 30 days, a proration would take effect. That would impact the remaining state aid payments, and it would be an across the board for school districts. It would be an across the board per pupil reduction in order to make up that shortfall. So Bethany kind of talked about, there are other options. Obviously, the legislature could then, in response to that, they could come back and negotiate or enact a negative supplemental in order to take those reductions or cuts in some other form or fashion rather than an across-the-board per pupil reduction. So that's kind of when the clock starts ticking, I'd say, is May 15th, when we're notified that our revenues are short in order to fund the entire budget.
So if I can, to be clear, when we're talking current year, and we're saying we're closer to $3 billion of current year shortfall, that's going to have to be made up before the end of September. And really there are two options there. One is a proration, which is completely out of the foundation. None of it comes out of the other categoricals, just the foundation.
Yeah, so really it requires us to calculate, we would take the entire shortfall for schools, and then we would put that into a per pupil terms. So each school district would receive a per pupil reduction from their total state aid. So it would not be specific to categoricals and such. It would just be equated to a per pupil.
Okay. So if we were to try to go after some of the categoricals, then it would take a negative supplemental, which is a negotiated solution between the governor's office and the legislature where they target those reductions in certain areas.
That is correct, Bob. And, I think one of the questions was, and you can, feel assured that we are doing all of the scrubbing right now that we can possibly do. We're looking for unspent funds. We're looking at things that we could potentially target to try and reduce that overall proration level or overall reduction level. We're looking at old year work projects. We're looking at things like restricted funds. So we're doing that throughout the entire, I would say, for all state agencies, but school aid is no different. So we are kind of doing that as an aside, just to see where we might have some funds to help with that.
Okay. And now just to be clear, though, this process, either a proration or a negative supplemental, is only for the $3 billion shortfall in the current year, the 2019-2020 budget year. We're talking about an additional $4 billion-ish shortfall for next year, 2020-2021.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have those exact numbers yet, and that proration wouldn't apply for the whole $3 billion, right? It would just apply for whatever share of that ends up being school aid. And the reason we haven't put out anything specific on some of the general fund, school aid fund splits are because some of them, each of the economists have a slightly different split. So we'll see. I think generally it seems that there's some general agreement that slightly more than half of that reduction is likely to be general fund. But it all just depends on, what the income tax withholding has looked like over the month of April. That will help inform, those revenue estimates, what the actual sales tax continued to be throughout the month of April. So, all the economists are looking at that right now and comparing some numbers. And so we'll have that better, a better split on those pieces by next week. So I would say, that yes, and that applies to fiscal year 20, and then we still have a 21 solution to solve. We don't know exactly what the size that it's less clear in the Treasury scenario that was put out, had something in the range of 4 billion. RSQE said 3.2 for next year. But either way, again, then once we do have a balanced budget for 20 and have some of those cuts in place, then we'll have to shift to 21. This is the first year where this past fall, the legislature adopted a bill that requires the legislature to put a budget bill or budget bills on the governor's desk by July 1. And unfortunately, this is a year where we're going into this with a lot of uncertainty. And so that whether or not that timeline still, we use that timeline is a little unclear, just because of all of that. So we do likely think that we might need to revisit some of those revenue estimates again in August. Some of that is because we'll have a better, clearer picture of sort of, how quickly the economy sort of bounces back as things start to reopen. Obviously, there's always a potential threat of another wave. And so we'll have to sort of see and how quickly people are willing to start participating in the greater economy, even if it is open. given, just sort of normal health concerns. And a lot of the feedback, we see in surveys sort of still seems like many people in the public will be skeptical about rejoining society immediately and fully in a way that we would have thought until we have some better security. So, that all will have an impact. So we might very well end up then having to revisit those. The other piece of it is that the income tax was postponed, the collection from April 15th to July 15th. So we'll have a little bit better understanding of what that does as well. That's based on 2019 income tax or income. So, those shouldn't change significantly, but by then we'll also have another couple of months worth of that data and a better picture. So, it's hard to tell sort of how quickly we'll get a 21 budget solution in place. We could always adopt one based on worst case scenario and then revisit. And if revenues are better later in the year, add back. That's certainly one way to go about it. Waiting is certainly another way. And obviously, when we had the Great Recession and all of those years, there were a lot of times where we didn't have a budget in place until late in the year. So it's really unclear yet where we're going to go on that piece of it.
Okay. We're going to go to the Q&A now, start taking some questions. Steve Carlson, you've got a couple in there, but I think one in particular about handling reductions for the current year. You should be unmuted. Go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right, great. So it sounds like we should be expecting some form of a proration or negative supplemental in the current fiscal year. So my question for Bethany and Beth, is it wise for us to start planning now how we might handle those reductions, even though we don't exactly know when we might know the certainty of them?
I think this is Beth, and I can let Bethany chime in as well. But I think, we've done a few of these with school groups. And I think, it would be prudent to start doing some planning scenarios. Maybe you do kind of like we're doing at the state level. We've kind of got a good, bad, or worse scenario going. And so that would be prudent, I think, for schools to start planning to that effect. If you plan for it and it doesn't happen, then you're at least prepared and you've got, some sort of good news on the horizon. But at least you're prepared. So yeah, I would say that would be prudent to kind of start planning for scenarios.
And can I just jump in on the, sort of how uncertain, and I think this was on some of Bob's list of questions too. I mean, for us, the hard part is, to even give you scenarios, the problem could be anywhere from zero. Let's say the feds come through in a big way in the next 10 days and, both provide additional state funds and allow us to use them in a revenue backfill sort of way, then there might be some interest to obviously hold those of you who don't have a lot of time left in your budget harmless. And then we would, be able to get by with minimal cuts in 20 and focus on 21. So, there's that possibility. There's a possibility that we don't get either retroactive flexibility or any additional funds. And we're left having to solve that entire hole. I should point out that the state does have about $1.2 billion in its budget stabilization or rainy day fund, similar to a school fund balance. That $1.2 billion is less than 5% of a combined school aid and general fund revenue. So, obviously, I'm sure all of your local accountants would tell you, it'd be great if all districts could have, at least 10% of their, operating expenditures or operating revenues in a fund balance. We obviously don't at the state level either. So, but we could potentially use a portion of that. Statute currently says we can only withdraw 25% at any given time. So if we were going to, look at any more than that, we'd have to have a legislative bill to look at that as well. So there are a couple of other tools, but obviously not large enough to solve the whole problem. And it's why the federal, what happens in DC right now is such a big driver on what comes next.
Sure. Jen Bustard, you should be unmuted. You have by far the most popular question in the Q&A. Bethany and Beth, you're on the spot now. Sorry.
So literally the million-dollar question. Can you offer any perspectives on how deep the cuts could be that we're talking about? Specifically, MASSA is talking about per pupil cuts between $100 and $650 per pupil. So we're in the planning phases. What do you suggest districts target and plan for?
Well, again, this is Beth. So, I mean, I hesitate to actually give you a number today to target. Again, I think it would be prudent to go maybe with 2 or 3 different scenarios, a good, bad, and worst scenario. Just to give you, I guess, a rule of thumb. So a $500 million shortfall in the school aid fund equates to about a $345 per pupil reduction. So, you know, just to kind of give you a sense of the magnitude when we're talking, you know, $1 billion to $1.3 billion or something just in school aid, that just gives you, you know, a sense of kind of what we're talking about. So,
Beth, can you repeat that number? You said 500 million equates to a $340 per pupil?
About $345 per pupil for a $500 million shortfall.
So much good news.
Sorry. Yeah.
I thought you guys were going to come on and tell us that you'd found the state's money tree. It was behind the governor's residence the whole time, right next to the substitute teacher bush.
That would be nice. Yes.
It would be. All right. So, Todd Simmons, you've got a question about options. You should be able to unmute yourself, Todd. Go ahead if you're there.
Can you hear me, sir?
Yes, I can, sir.
Awesome. Thanks for joining us today. Thank you very much for doing this for all of our building leaders across the state. My question is, with it being this late in the year, there are very few ways schools can adjust their budgets if there is a reduction. Do you have any options or suggestions that schools might do to respond to such a reduction immediately?
Unfortunately, you know, I don't know that we have a silver bullet for you, but just to give you a sense of all of the things that we're looking at the state level. I mean, we've issued a hiring freeze on all new hires. You know, we've got a discretionary spending freeze going on just to kind of be prudent with the money that we do have. We're looking at any other sources of budget reductions that we could make. Without regard to an across-the-board proration, understanding that schools are, you know, well into their fiscal year, and there are not a lot of options there. But, you know, Bethany also mentioned the state's rainy day fund. If there are potential, you know, fund balance, you know, I think we just have to put all things on the table when we're looking at how we address a budget shortfall of this magnitude. So I don't know, Bethany, do you have any other thoughts to add?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think that's really, you know, it has to be a very local decision, and it'll vary probably pretty drastically from one district to the next, depending on, you know, your own situation, and, you know, the size of it will make that different, and the size of your available fund balances and what you've been able to do, and you know, what your staff look like right now. And you know, we understand some of those pressures. There may be a way, and I know it's very early and I don't know how much of it would help you, but apparently there are some work share possibilities to be able to use unemployment to put some people on you know, basically a temporary layoff for a certain portion of each pay period. And then that way they could access some of the additional unemployment funds in a way that wouldn't hurt employees as much. But I think that calculation only works as long as the federal additional $600 of unemployment piece makes that a good trade-off for most employees. And we're just exploring some of that. I don't know if there are conversations yet happening about that at the school district level. I know there are some other conversations at the state level and with some of our, you know, private employers. So that might be a tool that people might be able to look at. But unfortunately, you know, it's just very hard to come up with a magic bullet when we're talking about these. Obviously, I think there will be interest in Lansing is trying to mitigate as much as we can on this side of the equation if possible.
So just a little bit of context on that. Don't know how familiar folks are with the CARES Act and the unemployment situation right now, but correct me if I'm wrong, Beth and Bethany, but the way this is working is that if you're laid off right now, you collect not only unemployment, but there's an additional federal grant of $600 per person per week for anybody who's laid off under the current situation because of closings and whatnot. Okay. So for those who, what that could mean is if you end up doing furlough days or things like that, and this is the scenario I think Bethany was talking about, districts could furlough employees, give them a chance to collect unemployment, and then when you add in the additional $600 per person, you could actually come out where the employee doesn't lose too much money on unemployment because they're backfilled by the extra $600. Next question. We've gotten several different versions. Jason Frink, you're on. We've gotten a lot of different versions of what you're asking, so I'm going to let you be the representative question on using federal money to pay for PPE.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. So obviously, we've got the reduction in revenue, but then we're also looking at additional expenses, PPE, thermometers, additional cleaning. We're probably in a lot of schools even having to change out furniture if we have to do social distancing. We're wondering what the likelihood that we would get some federal support for that would be.
I don't know, Bethany, if you have any indication of the future federal support, but I think it does appear to me that schools could use the ESSER funds or the money that they're getting through the Title I allocation for things related to COVID response. So those types of things could be paid for with those funds, I would believe.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an available pot. If it turns out we can't use any of this for revenue backfill, and we have to use all of the $3 billion that we have specific for COVID, we might be able to then offset some of those expenditures. We've been, getting requests from the smaller locals that didn't get an automatic share, and for both higher ed institutions and school districts. We might be able to then set up something where at least those costs we could help reimburse you with the CRF. And this is where we're in a hard spot with the CRF, because if they do give us revenue flexibility, backfill flexibility in 2 weeks, we want to make sure we haven't sent it all out, so that then when they say, never mind, we're not giving you more money because we already gave you a bunch, and then we've already sent it out, we couldn't offset those costs or our revenue. But at the same time, obviously, if we don't get that flexibility and we do have to do big cuts, we might be able to help some of those, pass-through entities at least cover some of the additional COVID costs, and then I know I've recommended what we're doing broadly is lobbying, our congressional delegation so that, we're really focused on additional state and local money and flexibility. And obviously from the state perspective, that will help us avoid school aid cuts. But, back at the time of the Great Recession and under ARA, we had a pretty significant federal specific, stimulus for school aid called EduJobs, and part of the state fiscal stabilization fund at the time had to go towards, maintaining funding for schools. And so that might be something that's on the table if they decide that they aren't comfortable giving states money directly, just unrestricted. They might do it in a way where we could at least, backfill or argue to backfill some of that for schools. So, so we're talking to them a lot. I would, highly recommend that in all of your advocacy, you focus on additional funds to the state, whether or not it's directly to the state or to schools, that will all help. As I think there's some recognition in DC that, what states and locals are facing is much larger than what was in the first bill, the first big bill, but there's a lot of political opposition as well right now. And, so it's a little unclear, and it's a little unclear what the strings might be that are attached to it. But this is a 50-state problem. We're talking to the National Governors Association and using them. We have weekly calls with the state budget officers of all 50 states to see, how we can try to be creative about using these funds if we can't get them for revenue backfill, and to advocate for some of those additional funds. So, where you can, do that too. Use your association if possible to do that too.
And so just to grab another question that was asked, it sounds like it would be very wise for schools to keep track of any COVID-related expenditures that they have, to be able to enumerate those in great detail later if it turns out that the federal aid we get is going to be limited to just being able to backfill COVID-19 related expenses.
Yeah, I think that'll be helpful, not only so that once we have it, you could account for it, but two, because, if it looks like this is going to be, how we can spend funds, we might need to be asking districts, to sort of quantify how much you might be facing, and to determine, sort of how the state allocates these funds out. If we split it up into pots, what might be appropriate sizes of pots. So it'll help to inform those decisions as well.
Okay. Eric Curl, you had a question about conditions you need to meet.
Yes. Thank you, Bob. And thank you, Bethany and Beth. My question kind of went along with Jason's to an extent. Oftentimes when states receive federal money, particularly for education, there are certain conditions or steps that they have to take to reach it. And I know you had talked about lobbying and advocating for flexibility, particularly for states to be able to use that money to backfill tax revenue. Has there been any talk of what conditions may be put on states or schools with federal money when it comes to education expenses?
So this is Beth. So there are, the Michigan Department of Ed had to submit an application to the feds for the Title I allocation piece. The governor's application is somewhat similar, and there are probably about 2 pages of assurances that have to be attested to in order to receive those funds. Many of them are fairly standard. They're fairly standard for most federal flow-through funds that come to the states. There are a few I would say I would highlight. One is that states, districts, and higher ed institutions have to keep employees or keep staff employed to the extent practicable. So, I don't have a lot of guidance in terms of what that means for folks. That obviously gives us a little bit of flexibility, but we have to attest that we will keep employees on staff. There's also an equitable services provision, and I believe that the U.S. Department of Ed, I believe there's conversations with the U.S. Department of Ed. So this is similar to the Title I provision that LEAs have to provide equitable services to non-public school students and teachers. So that is an assurance that states have to attest to, as well as when the local districts apply for these funds, they'll also have to attest to those provisions. I'm trying to think. Those were really, I guess, top. From the top of my head, those were kind of the most key assurances. But I think, once you start to see an application, the Michigan Department of Ed will have applications, I think, available very shortly. And you can expect to see those applications with all of those assurances that districts, will attest to before they actually apply for the funds.
How broad of a definition are we likely talking about here for what's considered COVID-19 related? Tough to tell.
What we have seen, at least a little bit on the coronavirus relief fund piece, that big state stabilization piece, is, obviously, if you can, and I don't know where schools are on the FEMA drawdown. I mean, and FEMA is time limited in some ways too. It's like immediate response, but we're trying to push as many of the PPE and, some of those types of things through FEMA, but obviously then, additional payroll where that's necessary. And sometimes that's been overtime or premium pay, we think is an allowable use. We're still getting and waiting for some fine tuning on that guidance to figure out exactly what, which staff that might mean. But then anything you're going to need to spend money on, I think cleaning supplies, I think building upgrades, or, retooling of some of your workspaces. I think obviously anything in your digital education, distance learning, anything in that space is clearly, a potential eligible use from those kinds of things. So I think the one thing that CRF did say specifically, unfortunately, because I was hoping we'd be able to use it creatively to get around this, was getting ready to and doing anything you need to prepare for or implement distance learning, and the devices and all of those things will count, at least under the CRF. Simply paying you to deliver instruction through distance learning does not count as a different expense, at least under CRF, compared to anything like delivering instruction that we already had built into the budget. So we can't, for instance, reduce one of the state aid payments and replace it all with CRF, because now you're delivering instruction differently, which would have been a nice, but turns out unallowed.
You guys, if you needed it, that your state budget office is trying to be creative on your behalf. Jeff, you had a couple of different questions. We might have answered your one about restrictions on federal monies, but what about your Title I question?
Just quickly on the restrictions question, what I haven't heard is how likely do you think it is that there will be additional flexibility on what we can spend the federal funds on? Would you say that that's likely or unlikely, given your knowledge of history?
So, I have gone through probably as much emotional turmoil over this exact question on a day-to-day basis for the last month as anything I can remember in recent times. We've been working really closely with our DC office and our congressional delegation, and we went from days where we thought it was a for sure thing in the 3.5 version, and Senator Schumer was saying he had gotten a deal with the White House and that we were going to get that retroactive backfill, to then it not being included in the bill. And all of a sudden, the president and Mitch McConnell saying, no way, we're not giving states any more money. States should go bankrupt. It's just been such an extreme swing from one day to the next. The Speaker Pelosi has made additional state and local funds and that flexibility the number one priority that they have been advocating for round 4. So we think it's very high on her list. She's also significantly upped the level of request, which means, the more she asks for, even if she gets a quarter of what she's asking for now, would still be more than we got through the first round. And so that would be great. We've had a lot of health providers coming to the state asking for more money out of the CRF, and they are on the very front line. So I don't want to diminish what they're seeing at all. But they've in combination received $175 billion now in federal stimulus, while all state and locals have only received $150 billion. And so we're in a spot where we have our own revenue shortfalls. And so it's very hard to look at backfilling their revenue shortfalls that they're seeing because they can't be doing some of the normal types of healthcare that they would otherwise be delivering to. So I think I think it's a high priority.
Possible, but don't hold my breath. Is that what you're saying?
Well, we're really hopeful. We think that the House might release their version of a budget by hopefully the end of next week. And then, it'll take another week or two, maybe. We're hoping that by the end of May, we would potentially have a deal in DC. So, I'm hoping that this is all happening simultaneously, and that, we'll be having these budget cutting conversations, and that maybe in the end, they'll bail us out. But I don't think that precludes having to do all of the very tough work and tough decisions about what we'll do in the meantime if we don't. And that unfortunately means you guys have to do the same thing.
That's helpful. Thank you. Bob, you want me to ask my other question too, or no? I guess I'll go ahead and ask it. There was one slide, there's a bunch of federal funds that you noted were going to be allocated by Title I parameters. Does that mean that non-Title I schools are not going to be eligible for that money?
That is correct. So the 90% of the ESSER funds would go out to Title I eligible districts. However, there is the remaining 10%. Like I said, I mean, this will be something that the Department of Ed and the superintendent will likely decide on that, but there is some flexibility, I would say, on that 10% side.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, one question in the Q&A from somebody who doesn't have a mic, so I'm going to ask it, and then I'm going to hand it over to Deb Paquette for our last live question. Question is concerning layoffs. Under the EO right now, districts cannot lay off staff, as you guys I'm sure are well aware, but if we're talking about balancing budgets moving forward, is there likely to be a change to the EO so that districts may be able to lay off or furlough staff in order to start saving money and looking into some of those creative solutions we've been talking about?
I don't know if Bethany has anything to add. I mean, I think it's fair to say that when the EO, you know, when they were originally issued, we were in a very, very different space and in terms of the budget outlook. So I think that the governor's office is very aware of this particular issue. You know, they were really focused, kind of laser focused on the learning continuity plans and ensuring that there was kind of continued learning going on. But obviously the budget outlook has changed significantly since then. So I can't speak necessarily for the governor's office and whether they'll address that specifically, but I can say that they're fully aware of that issue.
Okay, thank you. We're going to make Deb our last live question. Go ahead, Deb. You should be able to talk.
And I'm looking at some of the state funding, school funding guidance I'm receiving from YO, their latest document they put out about allowable funding or allowable uses for the ESSER money. That last bullet says other activities that are necessary to maintain the operation and continuity of services. So it might be wishful thinking, but I'm just interpreting that to mean that if I have to take a $1,000 per pupil cut, I certainly can't maintain operations and staffing. So why wouldn't we be able to use these funds for staffing into 2021?
Yeah, I think we'll obviously, we're still waiting for some clearer guidance from the feds on this particular issue. But I think you bring up a valid point. I mean, they put the phrase in there for continued functionality. So there is some question, you know, what that means, I think, going forward. So you bring up a very valid point.
All right. One more detailed question that I'm going to want to ask you guys to end on sort of the big picture note. You mentioned earlier the Department of Ed's allowed to withhold 10% of the money flowing into the state, the ESSER money. Any idea what's happening with that 10% right now?
I can only tell you, again, I don't want to speak for Dr. Rice, and I don't want to speak for the department, but I believe, you know, kind of their intention is to really look at where there might be gaps in need once this 90% is distributed out to local districts. They're still, I think, looking at the learning continuity plans to see where the digital divide is. I think that could potentially be a focus of those funds. But they're really trying to think strategically on how they can use that 10% to kind of make fill in some gaps where the 90% didn't necessarily get to, or maybe it's not enough, or so that's all I can really say about what the department, I think, is looking at in terms of the 10%.
Fair enough. So if I can we just jump back to bottom line numbers and maybe pull up that slide again that has what the expected shortfall range is? It sounds like, if I'm summing this up correctly, you guys are expecting on the high end of this shortfall, so something like $3 billion-ish shortfall in the current year, and you're saying that it's best to plan on a $4 billion-ish shortfall for next year. And if I want to repeat the numbers, you said you're not exactly sure what the split's going to be between general fund and school aid fund, but we're looking at an equation that says that a $500 million cut to K-12 equates to about a $345 per pupil figure. Is that a fair summary of sort of the big high level picture of this thing?
I think that's true. At least I would say on the 20 picture. I don't know, if we'll get to as far as $4 billion for fiscal year 21. I think that part is a little less known. So they might end up not going as to that extreme end on 21. So we haven't really seen any of the 21 numbers yet to come out. But I mean, I feel like at least for the current year, we feel like we're on that high end for the current year.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you, Bethany and Beth, for joining us today and answering all of our questions. We're at the 1 hour mark, so we're going to call it close on the questions. Thank you guys very much for joining us and taking so much time with us.
Thank you, and thanks for all you're doing out there, and hopefully we'll have some good news.
Yes, hopefully we will.
Yes, thanks for having us.
Thank you guys so much.
Thanks.
So just to close it out today for folks, I know we're going to lose some folks pretty quickly here, but thinking forward, I just want to frame this a little bit, that it might be a good idea as you're trying to plan what you can do in your district to take a think globally and act locally strategy. So some quick things you can do right now without having to do a whole lot else. You can share what you learned today with your colleagues, share it on social media. You can show the Know Before You Go video to other folks so that they can get an idea, and you can pass along the information you learned today. You can engage with your district leaders in planning, or even contact your legislators and make sure that they know what big cuts are going to mean. But to contextualize this at the building level, it's important that especially you guys as principals are taking a look at what you can do within your building and taking a look at what's within your control. So looking at next year and looking at what we're talking about in terms of potential cuts, and even this year, think about what the impact might be on your school calendar, on district provided professional development days and hours, what your contingency days might look like, how you're going to approach the fall, and including things like student activities, looking at split and staggered schedules. That drawing in the lower left came from Colin Rittmaster at MASSP. He said, okay, 6 foot bubbles around people, need to make sure we've got good social distancing. He took his 30 by 30 classrooms that he used to have in his building, broke it up into a 6 by 6 grid and said, good, great. And then he counted the squares between the desks and realized that he actually only had 4 foot spacing, and that what he was actually looking at was something closer to 12 to 15 students in a classroom rather than 20. So thinking ahead about how you can adjust for some of these new realities and how you might be able to adjust instruction in your building to respond, knowing what you now know about the budget is something that's very much within what you can control now. So with that, thank you for joining us today for Leader to Leader, and make sure that you look ahead at your calendar. We have upcoming Leader to Leader seminars on May 14th, the 21st, 26th, and through June 11th, and you can see the schedule there. Thank you all very much for joining us today, and again, thanks to Beth and Bethany for being with us.
Thank you.